When I've given public talks in the past on the subject of magic, I know it's only a matter of time until I'm asked the question, does magic work? It's not a bad question by any means, and honestly, I think my answer to this question has shifted a great deal over time, and I'm actually very happy to answer it each and every time I get this question, because it allows me to revisit what is a deceptively simple question. And don't worry, I'm already planning a video in which I try to give my current answer to this question, does magic work? Or rather, for me at least, an answer to the question, what would it mean for magic to work? This question, does magic work, is actually revelatory to me. It's an extremely modern question, one that I don't think most medieval or classical people would have ever thought to have asked. In their mind, of course magic works. Of course magic is real. If I were giving a public talk on magic in, say, 1320 rather than in 2020, I doubt seriously that anyone in the crowd would ever ask me, is magic real? Rather, I think that the majority of people in that crowd would ask, how do I protect myself from magic? How do I protect my family from magic? And really, how do I protect my crops from magic? As you may know, the most terrifying form of magic throughout the entire Middle Ages is the ability of witches and sorcerers to affect the weather. A minority of people would probably come up to me secretly after the talk and ask, hey, could I buy you a drink if you tell me how to do magic? And I think an even smaller minority still might think to themselves, how does magic work? Notice in asking this question, how does magic work, they've already fundamentally accepted the idea that it does work, but they've begun to push deeper into the question, asking, by which mechanism is magic actually effectuated? In that question, how does magic work, I think is a properly pre-modern question. This is the first video in a series that's going to explore just that question. How did people and how do people understand magic to work? That is, I want to explore various theories of magic. In this episode, we're going to explore the stellar ray theory of magic, developed in the 9th century by the Islamicate philosopher Al-Kindi. His theory would underwrite much of medieval magical theories, but also astrology and medicine, and survives in a kind of surreptitious way in modern New Age theories of energy. It's this stellar ray theory that will prove the dominant theory in the astral magic of the Picatrix, but will survive through the entire Middle Ages all the way into the modern period, and I would say all the way into the post-modern period that we're currently living in. And I hope you'll join me on this episode as we explore Al-Kindi's theory of the stellar rays and how they, according to him, create magic. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. We live in a period where the basic structures of physical reality have more or less been worked out. Not perfectly and not completely, but there's something amazing in that even a phenomena such as quantum electron tunneling can be harnessed to actually improve the effectiveness of semiconductors. We often take all of this for granted. But if we were to rewind time, it's amazing how much of the inner working of physical reality quickly becomes a mystery. The constitution and behavior of light, the propagation of disease, the nature of fire, the fundamental constitution of extended substances truly become the object of diverse speculation as the dial of time drifts backwards. One of those mysteries, and it's still mysterious, is just how remote causation happens. When I place my hand near a fire, how is it that the flame is transferring the heat to my skin? When I look at stars at the night, how is it that the light is traveling from there to my eye, and from my physical eye to my non-material mind? When a lodestone or a magnet attracts iron filings, how does it do this? How does the moon reach down to the earth and affect the tides? And I think pressing in this time period, how is it that sickness can spread from ship to person to town to continent? This question of remote causation is genuinely perplexing, and some of the greatest scientific and philosophical minds have attempted comprehensive answers over the ages. We are still fundamentally asking this question when we investigate, quote, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it, between entangled particles. This conversation goes on. One of the more interesting answers to this question was provided by the Islamic philosopher Al-Kindi, born sometime around 801 of the Common Era and dying in around 873. He was born in what is now Iraq and was a genuine genius whose mind soared over virtually every field of speculation available to him. From music theory to philosophy to cryptography to religion, he was even a skilled calligrapher. I can't even summarize the intellectual output. He wrote over 250 volumes during his lifetime, but it's suffice to say that minds like his are an absolute miracle and a boon for all of humanity. In this episode, I want to focus in on one of his shorter, though at least in the Middle Ages, extraordinarily popular works, De Radii Stellarum, or On the Stellar Rays. This book survives only in Latin. Sadly, the original Arabic has been lost to history. But it's in this text that we get his theory of the stellar rays, and by extension, his theory of how magic operates. This aspect of the book, that is how magic operates or how magic works, was so popular that the book was actually given the subtitle Theorica Artium Magicarum, or something like the theory of the arts of magic. And this book often appears appended to other books of magic, especially astromagic and astrology, of course. The work itself is relatively short. In the modern Latin edition, it only runs to about 45 pages. It's kind of weird to say modern Latin edition, but the text covers a lot of ground quite quickly, from metaphysics to epistemology to philosophy of language, and of course, well, magic. There was some debate if the text was actually composed by Al-Kindi or not, but experts on Al-Kindi, including Peter Adamson, the host of The History of Philosophy with No Gaps, have concluded that it is in fact by Al-Kindi, although probably a work composed toward the very end of his life. Al-Kindi's philosophy was a synthesis of ideas from Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists. What's important to understand about Islamicate philosophy at this time is that Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists are all kind of jumbled together in their mind. One of the more famous documents written at this time was a text called the Theology of Aristotle, which actually wasn't written by Aristotle at all. It is in fact several sections of the Enneads of Plotinus stitched together and forming a new book in Arabic. So largely what we have are Platonic metaphysical speculation combined with Aristotelian physics. So in some sense, you get the best of both worlds. You get all of the really neat metaphysical speculation that you find in someone like Plato, combined with the rigorous physical theories of Aristotle, along with some of his metaphysics, especially his cosmology. And this is no more evident than in Al-Kindi's theory of the stellar rays. For Al-Kindi, the stars act as a kind of primal radiators of the Platonic forms. These are the universals like beauty itself, justice, equality, oneness, and goodness itself. These forms, according to Al-Kindi, are filtered down through the cosmos to the sub-lunar world where we live and are responsible for the qualification of all matter. That is to say, from the stellar radiation, the forms persist down through into physical matter, and that's how physical matter becomes qualified or gets qualities, like goodness or redness or tallness or beauty. Not only do these rays filter down, but they reflect, interact, and refract with one another as they pass down through the stellar world into the sublunar world, our world, and then begin to interact with the qualities found in our world. For instance, how this might work is that a person born under the influence of the star Mars, and I'll say more about what it means to say that Mars is a star in this theory in just a moment, but a person born under the influence of the star Mars might be given over to a warlike personality, or might even be born with red hair, the color associated with Mars. But note here, right, that the ancients thought that Mars was a star. In fact, we can even see this in the word planet, the name that we give to those celestial bodies. The word planet comes from the Greek planesthai, which means to wander. The planets, as we know them, were simply wandering stars. They're stars that didn't stay in the fixed background with the rest of the stars. So Mars, Jupiter, Mercury were stars, just like we would see stars in the belt of Orion in the night sky. It's the interaction of all these stellar rays that for Al-Kindi produces a kind of cosmic harmony. And this has a bit of a Pythagorean flair to it. In fact, one of his favorite terms, oft repeated in the text on the stellar rays, is the term armonia. It's the harmony of all the stellar rays that produces reality as we know it. Not only do the stars radiate, but according to Al-Kindi, so does everything else, further complicating the radiation pervading the cosmos. Insofar as the interaction of the rays is basically causative, and I think these interactions are just causation for Al-Kindi, the sage, through their knowledge of the universals, can not only understand the complex relations between the rays and arrive at true knowledge of reality, and this is the clincher, they can learn to manipulate the various radiative fields, thus creating non-natural or supernatural causation. The expert manipulation of the totality of all these rays, especially the rays which cause supernatural causation, are just what we call, well, magic. So how is it that the sage is able to do this? Magic, according to Al-Kindi, is accomplished in several different means. The first is by the power of voice and speech. Al-Kindi shows how oral communication, or sonic radiation as I think he would have understood it, actually has numerous apparent effects on reality. For instance, the ability of birds to call one another, the ability for me to project my voice, the ability for me to talk to someone and communicate ideas from inside my head into someone else's head. So there are apparent ways in which oral communication or sonic radiation affects apparent reality. But for Al-Kindi, words and language also can have occult effects. That is to say, they can have unseen effects, or they can affect things through otherwise non-apparent means. These powerful or magical words have the ability to transform the cosmos through speech alone. Of course, intoning these magical words have to be done with the correct intention, with a very powerful will, and with a clean moral conscience. Of course, this idea of using magical words through speech goes back all the way to antiquity. We see this in ancient magic in classical antiquity. We see this also in Jewish magic and several other forms of magic. But the key idea here is that for Al-Kindi, it is actually a kind of oral radiation. It's a kind of vibration or ray that emerges through speech, and it's the interaction of that oral radiation that actually accomplishes this supernatural causation. Another way by which the sage can accomplish this magic is through the use of powerful images. According to Al-Kindi, the mage can also capture, compress, and focus the power of the astral rays into the creation of certain kinds of images, sigils, symbols, and talismans. In fact, the word talisman enters English via Arabic. The images and figures that Al-Kindi has in mind are those that emerge in the Greco-Egyptian context and go on to become central in both Arabic astral magic, but also in European necromantic magic. I've made a separate video about the history and development of those symbols if you're interested. Finally, the most powerful mode of manipulating the cosmic radiation is through animal sacrifice. According to Al-Kindi, when an animal dies naturally, its rays just sort of slowly dissipate back into the cosmic harmony. However, when the sage purposely kills that animal, this unnatural death causes such a rapid, violent release of the rays of that animal, specifically what Al-Kindi calls the central and ruling unity of that animal. This serves as a kind of very powerful focus. This violent rupture in the structure of the radiation itself allows the sage to sort of insert their will upon the structure of reality. They can focus the violent energies released through the sacrifice in the furtherance of their magical will. Of course, all of this magic is only possible when the confluence of the stellar rays, that is to say from the rays of the outmost stars to the interaction of the rays emerging from physical bodies, are in the correct sympathetic relationship, and certain rituals have to be performed to focus the rays, and all of this of course relies on the intention of the sage themselves. For Al-Kindi, the conscience of the sage must be clear, they must rely on powerful intentions and desires, and they have to have an extremely sophisticated understanding of how all of these cosmic rays are interacting with each other at any given point in time. And it goes without saying that misunderstanding the cosmic network of all the rays can cause all manner of dangerous, unpredictable, and unintended consequences. Grasping both the apparent and occult interaction of the rays is the goal of a unified science and magic for Al-Kindi. These two practices are simply two aspects of the same task: understanding, predicting, and controlling the fundamental forces of reality, an enterprise we're still undertaking to this day. It's no doubt that Al-Kindi would understand a great deal of what we do in modern science, for instance, the harnessing of extreme wavelengths of light, or the power of electromagnetism, as simply being magical. Having had the opportunity to visit the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, I have to say I agree with Al-Kindi. When I was there looking at some of these massive experiments, some of them stories tall, I was simply struck by an extreme sense of awe about the ability to harness some of the most primal and powerful forces of nature in an attempt to understand them better. And I'm certain that if Al-Kindi were to walk into CERN, he would readily identify what they were doing there as magic. As Isaac Asimov famously pointed out, that a sufficiently developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. Al-Kindi's stellar ray theory is fascinating for several reasons. One is its attempt at a comprehensive theory of the various branches of metaphysics, epistemology, and physics, while providing a theory of magic and astrology that situates it within the natural order of the cosmos. For Al-Kindi, magic and nature work hand in hand. It's just that we don't understand the totality of all of the hidden relationships, the occult sympathies of the stellar rays. It's really the sage understands not just the apparent sympathies that we all see, for instance, the influence of the moon on the tides, but it's these underground, hidden, occult rays that once you learn to understand and predict them, you can also learn to manipulate them, and that is for Al-Kindi magic. But notice what appears to most people as being supernatural is just a high-level understanding of the natural forces which are simply just not apparent to most people. Further, this naturalization of magical powers importantly opened up the possibility of a magical practice not forbidden in Islam, but also in Christianity. Unlike, for instance, in necromantic magic, where a sort of ensnared spirit or demon is forced by the magus to perform some specific tasks, the manipulation of the rays is completely natural and requires no spiritual intermediary. So the upshot of Al-Kindi's theory vis-a-vis classical necromancy is that you just don't need to interact with demons. All you have to interact with is the stellar rays, and that puts you outside of the purview of engaging in illicit religious behavior. Now, this distinction between natural and ritual magic, which will become very important in the Middle Ages, is pretty blurry. But it at least opened up the possibility of an allowable form of magical practice where magic itself was overwhelmingly forbidden. I say that the relationship here is blurry because if you read the Al-Kindi text closely, it's clear that one has to perform certain kinds of rituals to affect and focus the rays in order to accomplish certain magical effects. And it's those ritual behaviors that are going to blur the line between what appears to be simply natural manipulation of forces in the universe to something that looks a bit more like illicit religious behavior, including Thabit ibn Qurra's very popular De Imaginibus, and of course the famed Picatrix, probably one of the most important magical texts of the Middle Ages. And it would be this astral theory of magic that would be among the first forms of learned magic to enter Western Europe via Islamicate Spain. I'll be doing a separate episode on the astral magic found in the Picatrix, but also in Thabit ibn Qurra's text, as part of our series on books of magic, so stay tuned for that. While Al-Kindi's speculations have not been borne out by the experimental data, it remains relevant just the same. And to be sure, his aim at a comprehensive theory that would unite philosophy, mysticism, and science is nothing if not noble. Further, the presence of occult forces in the universe has certainly been borne out. Indeed, without the concept of occult forces, contemporary physics simply couldn't be possible. Note that a very crude empiricism, the idea that there's nothing in the mind that's not first in the senses, simply can't accept the idea of occult forces like gravity, electromagnetism, or the very powerful forces that bind atoms together. So we might say that Al-Kindi's theory that occult forces structure the universe isn't far off. And of course, Al-Kindi's ideas survive, if not a little surreptitiously. We see them indirectly in figures like Anton Mesmer and the ideas like animal magnetism. And of course, the ideas of energy in the New Age movement, from everything from Reiki to contemporary astrology, fundamentally rely on some version of Al-Kindi's theory. If you're interested in the history of theorizing about magic and occult forces, make sure to subscribe, stay tuned, and consider supporting Esoterica on Patreon. This is the first in a series on theories of magic, and we're going to be exploring everything from classical theurgy to mesmerism and beyond. If you're interested in Al-Kindi, I think the main and best text to pick up is Peter Adamson and Peter Porman's 2012 translation is pretty good, although regrettably it actually leaves off the entire second half of the text on the stellar rays, which covers the sections on magic. So again, this is an unfortunate situation where we have the text being translated by very capable, very talented folks, them leaving off the sections on magic because I think that perhaps Adamson and Porman don't think that they're of philosophical relevance. I would have to disagree here, and I think it's a pity that they don't get translated. And I would highly recommend checking it out, along with other texts by Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi is just a genius in general, and it's really worth checking out his other works as well. Zoller and Hand, I think in 1993, produced an entire translation of On the Stellar Rays, although I have to say that in a couple of places I find this translation a little questionable. Of course, the problem really begins with the Al-Kindi text itself. The translation from the Arabic to the Latin is a bit clunky. Now, we don't have the Arabic original. I took a look at the original Latin text when I was preparing for this episode, and I have to say that it's pretty clunky even in the original Latin. It was never a terribly competent translation to begin with, and unfortunately, I think in the hands of Zoller and Hand, it doesn't get much better. And I think they admit as much in their introduction. I've included a link in the description to the modern Latin edition, so if you read Latin, it's certainly the best place to go. And the introduction, if you read French, is still among the most solid in the literature. So I would highly recommend checking out the original Latin translation if you read some Latin. And if you read French, the introduction is really substantial. The best study of Al-Kindi's impact on Western magic is The Arabic Influences on Early Occult Philosophy by Liana Saif, or Saif. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. If anyone knows the correct pronunciation, please let me know in the comments below. And I will say this is an amazing work of scholarship. I just wished it weren't quite so costly. So I would ILL it if you have the chance, and this is a crucially important book for understanding the development of magic in the Western world and how Islamicate ideas and thinkers greatly shaped how magic would develop in the Western world. And I would really recommend taking a look at this if you can get your hands on it. Of course, the standard reference for all of this is the completely inexhaustible 8-volume History of Magic and Experimental Science by Thorndike. I have a copy of it on my shelf, and I will tell you that in my lifetime, I don't think I'll ever get through the whole thing. And even if I did, I could start over and still learn more than I could possibly imagine. So if you have a local library that has a copy of the text by Thorndike, just check it out all the time. It is an incredible resource. It's a bit dated, but it is aged incredibly well, and it is still, without any doubt, the most important starting point for understanding the history and development of magic in the Western world. I'll also say that in the course of doing research for this episode, I found a really incredible commentary on the stellar rays by, I think, an undergraduate student, Esme L.K. Partridge, that I think you can find on her Academica profile. I had the chance to download it and look over it, and I will say this is just a really amazing piece of intellectual work done by this person. So if you have the chance to download it and you're interested in Al-Kindi, it is an amazing text. And if it is in fact produced by an undergraduate, I have to say I am very impressed, absolutely impressed. I'll include a link to that document in the description as well. So check that out. It is a substantial piece of scholarship. If you're interested in theories of the occult and magic, stay tuned. It'll be a mainstay here at Esoterica, and I hope you'll join us. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.